He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
The lettuce will go off. That'll be my big waste area.
Yeah, well, those things in the back of the fridge, they're out of sight.
Have you got something in the fridge that's not being used?
I hate wasting food. Oh, yuck, no. It's like throwing money away to me.
In fact, it's $1,500 that the average New Zealand household throws out every year. So if you want to save some money, check your fridge and maybe your green bin. I know I will be, because that could be where some of that money's going. Kia ora, I'm Katy Gossett, and welcome to Thrift. This episode is all about food waste. Our theme is that old saying, waste not, want not. The idea that if we don't waste food now, we'll have some left over for later. The trouble is, not everyone's eating their leftovers. We've talked briefly about food waste before, but once I heard those figures on just how much food we're chucking out each year, I realised that this topic, like the leftovers in our fridge, deserves a second chance.
So this is my food scraps. We keep it in a bowl on the bench, which most people might find disgusting, but it works for us.
That's Kaitlin Dawson, Executive Director of New Zealand Food Waste Champions. I've popped around for a visit, and the bowl, well actually there are two bowls, are one of the first things I notice. In fact, they looked so elegant at first I thought they were food, but no.
So right now we can see the eggshells and the coffee grounds and a bit of last night's dinner.
Of course it's not that unusual. I also keep a compost bin on my kitchen bench. But Caitlin's don't have lids, and whereas I have piles of other things on my bench top, in Caitlin's very tidy house, they stand out as a very intentional way of avoiding food waste.
Out of sight, out of mind is a big cause of food waste. So when we can see it, we will work really hard not to waste that.
We'll come back to the idea of conscious habits in a bit. First up, a little bit about Kaitlin. She hails from Australia, where she's worked in a bunch of organisations, all devoted to rescuing and reusing food and reducing its waste.
It's such a win-win situation for the environment, but also for feeding people and for the economy. So for me, it was just a no-brainer.
Now she's here in Aotearoa, working alongside some of our big retailers. But she's also pretty concerned about what we're up to at a household level.
We waste over 130,000 tonnes of food per year.
So that number comes from a Rabobank Kiwi Harvest survey, and to quantify it,
that's enough to feed Dunedin for 3 months.
Now, as I said earlier, for an average household, we're throwing out $1,500 a year. And for the New Zealand economy,
that's about $3.2 billion.
That's a lot of money going into the green bin. So to work out what's being chucked and why, I suggested that we start with a wee poke in Caitlin's fridge.
Oh, scary. I don't know what my fridge looks like at the moment.
Well, we're about to find out. And yeah, I do get it. It's intimidating having someone poke into any aspect of your personal life, even your fridge. And so in return, I offer Kaitlin the opportunity to come and do the same at my house at a later date.
Can I poke through your fridge? Go through your bins?
Yes! What I'm really interested in is how the fridge is laid out and what is kept where, because this is tip 1. Storage is a huge part of not wasting food. Now, the first thing I notice is the bread. I don't personally keep mine in the fridge, but it turns out this is a good idea because
bread is by far and large the thing that we waste the most.
To the tune of?
About 15,000 tonnes a year.
Now that sounds like an incredible amount, but this is where the storage is important.
If we keep it in our bread box during the hotter days, it gets mouldy really quickly. So keeping that in the fridge.
Or indeed the freezer.
We put half our bread loaf in the freezer straight away.
Then we get to number 2 on the most wasted list, and I'm surprised to hear it's leftovers. Some of us make good use of them.
Leftovers? Lots of leftovers.
Mostly we take leftovers for lunch.
But some people aren't sure how long to keep their leftovers, so a good rule is 2 by 2 by 2.
Let it cool down for 2 hours, and then we store it in the fridge for 2 days. If we haven't eaten it, we pop it in the freezer for 2 months.
Sometimes leftovers come in the form of unexpected food.
We just had my son's birthday party on the weekend, so we've actually had a lot of surplus food that we wouldn't normally eat.
In those situations, what we should do is take that extra food and make it into some kind of meal.
If you're in your normal kind of habits, you don't think about the additional food or the fairy bread sitting in your fridge.
What could you do? There's probably some kind of old school English pudding that you could use.
Yeah, like a fairy bread and butter pudding.
Yeah, that was where my thoughts were going. Not that I've ever made such a thing.
Okay. Well, maybe tonight.
Maybe. So there you go. Get creative with that extra food. And remember, if fairy bread and butter pudding becomes a thing, you heard it here first. Now, the next item, which unfortunately also makes its way to the green bin, is fruit and veg.
Food that's taken a lot of effort and energy and land and water to grow, and then we buy it and put it in the bin, and that's $1,500 a year.
When I was a student, I had a friend who called the little drawer in the bottom of her fridge the veggie rotter because, as I'm sure you can guess, she put vegetables in there. They came out sometime later and pretty much went straight to the green bin.
And let's see if we're abiding by our...
I'm guessing Kaitlin doesn't have a veggie rotter.
So that's a thermic carrot in the left drawer.
What Kaitlin has is 2 drawers, one with old vegetables that need to be used first and one with fresher vegetables. In other words, it's a bit like a supermarket. She's rotating her stock.
So this right drawer is the use first drawer, and you can see this is a pretty bendy carrot. So we intend to use this first.
Now, I believe I am observing the sealed container of vegetables in action.
You are.
So about the storage containers, I have heaps of them at home in my fridge, mostly with leftovers in them, but Kaitlin uses them for raw vegetables.
To actually keep it fresher for longer, you can put a damp cloth in the storage container and then pop your fresh produce in there. It's not allowing oxygen to get to the food. So, for example, I think this pumpkin could benefit from being in a container.
Well, you should move it swiftly to the right-hand drawer.
Should. Look at that. We'll put it down there.
Then there are veggies and fruit that don't go in the fridge.
This is where our potatoes are stored.
It's best not to store potatoes alongside onions, for example, because they cause each other to sprout more quickly. The same with some fruit, which can make others ripen faster. So a good online resource for that kind of storage idea is lovefoodhatewaste.co.nz. Have a look and it'll tell you what kind of company your fruit and veg should be keeping. And then what about processed goods? That tin of baked beans that's been in the pantry for the last couple of years. Is that stuff still safe to eat?
I found things that are a couple of years past their expiry date, which are perfectly fine.
You're worrying me now.
Oh,
you look quite healthy, but
stuff in jars and that sort of thing.
Just to keep us on the safe side, Kaitlin has a list of likely shelf lives.
Biscuits last 6 months. Canned food lasts 12 months after the date that it has on the can. Certainly processed foods and dry foods can last a really long time.
Now, most of us probably know the difference between best before and use by dates, but Kaitlin says some people do still find it confusing, and she's aware of overseas retailers who are moving to ban best befores for that reason. So just for the avoidance of any doubt,
A best before date is the peak product date. So that's the date that it probably tastes the best.
But a product can be eaten after a best before date, whereas a use by date is set by the food regulator.
And that's for food safety, and we shouldn't eat food past the use by date.
So once you've got the storage sorted, tip number 2 is a bit more confrontational. It's identifying your habits and patterns. Be really honest with yourself about what you usually buy and what you know you usually throw out. Let's look back at some of the areas where we see the most waste. So bread, for example. Are you wasting part of the bread because you or someone in your household doesn't like crusts?
You can use those in other ways. Turn them into breadcrumbs, use them in recipes.
Now remember, the second most wasted food was leftovers. So again, examine your own behaviour. If you know you're not really a fan of leftovers, then just prepare smaller portions of your meal. Same with fruit and veg.
With apples and oranges, we don't buy heaps, probably like 3 or 4 at a time.
And think about how you're planning to use that food.
If we only want to eat it as the raw fruit, it might quickly go in the bin, whereas we can turn it into crumbles and use it for smoothies.
Another tip is using all of the fruit or vegetable if you're not already. So celery leaves, broccoli stalks, cauliflower stalks. Kaitlin also puts veggie scraps and peelings into her freezer. so she can pull them out later for stock or soup. And that's a good reminder if you want to not waste food, but you're not quite sure what to do with it just yet, just chuck it in the freezer and buy yourself some time.
Freezer is an amazing pause button, so if it's edible in some way, shape or form, it goes in the freezer.
Now we've put Kaitlin's fridge under a bit of scrutiny here.
I'm not going to give you a report card.
I probably give my own report card. I think doing your own food waste audit is a really useful challenge.
Actually, since I spoke to Kaitlin, I have started auditing my fridge, and I did have to throw out some old spicy noodles that were just too far gone. So maybe I do need Kaitlin to audit me.
Observe your habits at home. That's a very bread and butter pudding.
But speaking of our habits,
I mean, it would be remiss of me to not talk about what you do once you've got the food scraps.
because with the best will in the world.
You can see on my bench right now, banana peels.
Which brings us back to Caitlin's bowls of scraps. 9% of our methane emissions in New Zealand come from food scraps in landfills, and then globally that figure is 10% of all methane emissions that have come from food waste in landfills. So we don't want it going there. Kaitlin says most New Zealand households have or will soon get a green bin, so they can send that waste to compost. Again, it's about forming the habit.
So if it is storage, if it is setting up your kitchen better with your compost bin, having bags in the freezer for stock, there are so many things. Just choose a couple that make sense for you and make them a habit.
Okay, we've learned about storage and how to get some good habits happening. Now for tip 3. And, well, it's less of a tip and more of an interesting idea. And it's not something that will save you money right away, although you might find it rewarding in other ways. So I've always thought that when it comes to supermarket products, we just get what we get. But we may have more influence than we think. As I mentioned, Caitlin's been working with our large retailers to help them reduce waste. And she reckons that if we buy things like oddly shaped vegetables, for example, or we buy loose produce rather than in bags so that we can only get as much as we need, then we will see those products on the shelves.
Absolutely. If we are continuously choosing a certain type of produce or to purchase more locally or whatever it is that is most important to you, they will listen and they will ensure that more of that is there.
That's just a wee bit of food for thought. But again, we shouldn't waste it. Now, a quick recap. To avoid wasting food, we need good storage, good habits like stock rotation, composting, keeping food scraps in the freezer, and also, perhaps we have more power than we think. What a heady feeling. If we buy only what we need, maybe it could lead to less waste for the big suppliers. Next time on Thrift, energy efficiency. We'll look at how to cut that power bill down. For that and other episodes, you can follow and listen on your favourite podcast app. Special thanks to my guest in this set, Kaitlin Dawson from New Zealand Food Waste Champions. This podcast was produced and presented by me, Katy Gossett, engineered by Alex Harmer, and Tim Watkin is the executive producer of podcasts and series. If you have a tip for us, you can email thrift@rnz.co.nz. Thanks for listening. Ka kite.